The snow fell in thick, suffocating blankets, covering everything in a deep, haunting white. The trees and the forests surrounding the small cabin looked like skeletal hands reaching out of the darkness, their branches twisted in unnatural shapes. Inside, the fire crackled weakly, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. The warmth from the hearth was the only comfort in the otherwise chilly night. "I've had such a feeling," that she drew back the curtain to stare outside. But without expecting a storm, she saw only the long shadow. Unable to hold the torch steady just faint enough to make her question whether it was the storm, unable to shake the feeling that something was out there. The storm outside had intensified, howling against the walls of the cabin, and the wind seemed to carry an eerie whisper, just faint enough to make her question whether it was the storm or something else. Earlier in the evening, her brother Sam had gone out to check on the generator. He'd been gone for nearly an hour now, and she hadn't heard a word from him. Normally, Claire would have just assumed he was caught in the snowstorm, but tonight, her instincts were on edge. Something felt wrong. He hadn't been acting like himself lately, distant, like he was hiding something. She couldn't stop thinking about the strange phone call he'd received that afternoon, the one that made his face go pale and his hands shake as he spoke in hushed tones. The wind screamed louder, rattling the windows. Claire stood up, her knees weak, and made her way to the door. The lock was stiff, as if reluctant to let her out. She paused, her hand trembling as it hovered over the doorknob. The silence outside was suffocating, but the unease in her gut urged her to step into it. With a deep breath, Claire threw open the door. The cold hit her like a wall, and she immediately regretted her decision. The snow, now up to her knees, made every step feel like a heavy burden. She called out for Sam, her voice swallowed by the howling wind. No answer. She forced herself to move forward, the darkness thickening around her like a living entity. Her eyes struggled to adjust, the dim light from the cabin casting long, eerie shadows across the snow-covered ground. As she made her way to the edge of the forest, she thought she heard something. A crunch, faint but deliberate. She stopped, straining her ears. Nothing. Only the wind. She started to turn back, but then a shape emerged from the trees, just beyond the reach of the cabin's light. It was Sam. Her heart pounded in her chest, relief and fear colliding inside her. But as he moved closer, something was wrong. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes, wide, empty, stared through her, like he didn't recognize her. His clothes were torn, caked in mud, and his breath came out in slow, labored gasps, like he had been running for miles. "Sam," Claire's voice cracked. He didn't answer, he just stood there staring at her with that hollow gaze. Then, without warning, he lurched forward, his hand reaching for her with a jerky, unnatural movement. Claire stepped back, but her feet sank deeper into the snow, her body unwilling to respond. The wind picked up again, the cold biting at her skin. But it wasn't the cold that made her blood run cold. It was the look in Sam's eyes, like he wasn't even there anymore. "Sam, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. He didn't speak. Instead, he let out a low, guttural moan, something that wasn't quite human, and then he lunged at her, too fast for her to react. She barely managed to duck, her heart hammering in her chest as she stumbled backward. Sam's hand scraped at her coat, his fingers sharp as they dug into the fabric, pulling at her with unnatural strength. Claire screamed, but it was lost in the wind. She pushed him off, stumbling back toward the cabin, her legs trembling with terror. She could feel his presence behind her, even as she reached the door, her hand fumbling for the lock. Before she could get it secured, Sam's voice rasped from the shadows. "Don't. "Don't let it in," he wheezed. "Huh?" His words punctuated by wet, coughing sounds. But it wasn't Sam's voice. It was something else. Something far worse. She slammed the door shut and locked it, collapsing against it, gasping for breath. The cabin was silent now, except for her frenzied breathing. She leaned her head against the door, trying to steady herself, but her thoughts were racing. What had happened to Sam? What did he mean, "Don't let it in"? Was that really Sam? Or had something else taken his place? The thought chilled her to the bone. Minutes passed, and Claire could feel her grip on reality slipping. The wind outside had died down, replaced by an eerie stillness. It was almost worse, because in the silence she could hear something else. Something moving inside the walls. Scraping. She swallowed hard, the sensation of being watched growing stronger. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt tight, as though the air itself was thickening. Then, slowly, a sound broke the quiet. A soft tapping on the window. Claire turned, her breath caught in her throat. There, just outside the glass, was Sam, or at least what had been Sam. His face was pressed against the cold window pane, eyes wide and empty, blood dripping from his mouth, but the worst part was the thing behind him. A shape in the darkness, long and twisted, a grotesque silhouette that shifted unnaturally, like it wasn't quite solid, like it was made of shadows. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. "Sam?" she whispered, her voice breaking, though she already knew the answer. The thing outside wasn't him anymore. Whatever had come back was not her brother. And it was hungry. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, the sound now an unbearable rhythm. Claire's pulse quickened as she took a shaky step toward the window. Her heart hammered in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to turn away, to run. But her feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. She couldn't look away. She had to see it for herself, had to understand what had happened to Sam. Her eyes locked on the figure, its face now a hideous mask of blood and hollow eyes. It was still Sam, or at least the shape of him. His features had become gaunt, almost skeletal, the skin stretched taut over a frame that looked too thin for someone who had once been strong. His lips were pulled back, a grotesque parody of a smile, showing rows of teeth that didn't quite fit right. But it was the eyes, those dark, empty pits of nothingness, that sent a spike of ice through her heart. They were empty, devoid of life, yet full of something else, something far worse. Behind him, the shadow twisted. The shape was no longer merely a vague silhouette. It was solid now, rising from the ground like smoke, like some terrible thing forged from darkness itself. Long, spindly arms stretched toward her through the glass, the fingers impossibly long, scraping against the surface with an eerie screech. Claire took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the warmth of the fire behind her, but it was nothing against the cold that settled into her bones. The bone-deep terror that surged in her chest. Her gaze shifted toward the door, the one she had locked so tightly moments before. Was it enough to keep whatever it was out? Was there anything that could stop it? Suddenly, the glass of the window cracked, a sharp, jagged line appearing across the surface, as if something was pressing too hard from the other side. The tapping stopped, replaced by a long, drawn-out scraping sound. Claire's breath hitched as the window began to bow inward, as if the thing behind it was trying to force its way through. "No," Claire whispered, backing away, her hands trembling at her sides. She looked desperately around the room, at the bare walls, the fire slowly dying in the hearth, the creeping shadows stretching out like tendrils. Then a sound, a voice, echoed from the corner of the room. A low, guttural whisper, indistinct at first, but growing clearer as it drew nearer. The voice, Sam's voice, but not quite. It was like it was being filtered through something wrong, something deep, like it was coming from far below the earth. "Let it in. Let us in." The words weren't a plea. They weren't an invitation. It was a command. Claire's eyes darted toward the attic door, her breath caught in her throat. She remembered the dark shape in the attic, the strange noises from above, the feeling of being watched from all directions. The voice seemed to come from there, from the very heart of the house itself, like the house was alive. With shaking hands, Claire backed toward the fireplace, her mind racing for any kind of plan. What could she do? What was she supposed to do? She could still hear the scrape of claws on the window, the thing behind Sam trying to get in. But it wasn't Sam anymore. She had to remind herself of that. It wasn't Sam. The house was changing. The walls felt like they were breathing, pulsing with some malevolent energy. Every inch of it felt like it was pressing closer to her. The shadows had taken on forms of their own, shifting shapes in the corner of her vision, moving just beyond the light. Something else was in the house now. Something old. Something that had been waiting. And it was coming for her. Suddenly, the door to the attic creaked. Then, with an audible snap, it flung open on its own, as if it had been waiting for the signal. A gust of icy wind poured out from the dark opening, carrying with it the stench of decay and rot. Claire felt the temperature in the room drop, her breath visible in the cold air. It was the thing from the attic, she realized with a start, the thing she had been afraid of all along. "Don't!" Claire gasped, her voice trembling as she backed away from the door. Her eyes flicked to the window again, but Sam's figure was gone. The shadows had consumed him completely, and now all she could see were those terrible, shifting shapes. The creatures from the darkness. And then, out of the silence, the voice spoke again, but this time it was coming from all directions. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, it was everywhere. "It's too late, Claire. You're already part of it. You've always been part of it." Her heart froze. The words didn't make sense, but the meaning was clear. Whatever was happening to Sam, whatever had happened to him, it had happened before, to someone else, to something else. And Claire had been brought here for a reason. She had come here to feed it, to open the door. The door! Her hand shot out toward the knob, and for a split second, Claire hesitated. The sound of the thing moving behind her. Inside the walls, inside the house, grew louder. A sickening scrape of claws against wood, as if it were preparing to burst out at any moment. Her hand trembled, hovering over the door, her breath shallow and fast. But the voice was still there, growing louder now, desperate, hissing in her ear. "Let us in." Her hand closed around the knob. The air seemed to hold its breath as she turned it. The door slowly creaked open, revealing the shadow beyond. And there, in the doorway, Sam's face reappeared. But it wasn't Sam. It was something else entirely. Something worse. Behind him, the shadows were no longer just shadows. They had form. They were reaching for her, long, twisted limbs stretching through the doorway like they were hungry for something. For her. Claire stumbled backward, but the thing was too quick. Its hands shot out, grasping her, pulling her forward, dragging her toward the dark. The cold, so cold, pierced through her as she was pulled into the abyss. The last thing she heard was that voice ringing in her ears as the darkness swallowed her whole. "You've always been ours." The world around Claire collapsed into suffocating darkness, the cold gnawing at her skin as the thing dragged her further into the void. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs fighting to find air in the thick, oppressive chill. The shadows, twisted and insatiable, wrapped around her like 1,000 invisible hands, pulling her deeper into the abyss. She could hear them now, the soft rhythmic thud of something crawling in the dark. The sound of something waiting, watching. Her mind swirled, a fog of confusion and terror. Was it real? Was this her fate now? To be devoured by the dark? Or was it some nightmare, some fevered hallucination brought on by the isolation of the cabin and the storm outside? Her body ached, her legs shaking with every step she was forced to take, but no matter how hard she tried to break free, the grip on her arms tightened. It wasn't Sam pulling her, not anymore. That voice, that cold, guttural whisper that echoed through her very bones, was not her brother's. It was something ancient, something older than the house itself. "Let us in," the voice hissed again, closer this time, inside her head, reverberating through her skull. "We've always been here. We've always waited." "Oh!" Her eyes, wide with panic, darted around her, but there was nothing to see. The shadows were absolute. No light, no warmth, just an unyielding, suffocating blackness. Suddenly, she was jerked to a halt, thrown to the ground. The icy cold of the floor bit into her skin as she tried to scramble away, but there was nowhere to go. Her heart pounded so loud in her chest that it almost drowned out the whispers, but they kept coming, louder, more insistent. Her eyes strained, but still there was nothing, only blackness, and then a glimmer. A faint, sickly yellow light flickered in the distance, drawing her gaze. She could barely see, but it was enough, just enough, to make out shapes within the shadows. More figures, more of them, just like Sam. Hollow, distorted shapes that seemed to shimmer and writhe in the dim light. Her body trembled with fear, her mouth dry, but she had to move, she had to run, she couldn't stay here. Without thinking, her legs shot out beneath her, and she pushed herself up, but as soon as she rose, a cold hand clamped around her ankle, dragging her back down. She screamed, her voice a strangled cry that echoed through the cavernous blackness. The thing was whispering again, but now it wasn't a single voice. It was many, hundreds, thousands. The air was thick with the sound of their whispers, low, guttural murmurs filling the space around her. "Join us," they hissed. "Become one with the void. You're ours." She thrashed, desperate, pulling at the cold, unseen hands that gripped her with unnatural strength. Her nails scraped against something hard and jagged beneath her. She couldn't tell if it was stone or wood, just that it was wrong. Everything was wrong. A figure rose from the shadows in front of her. At first, Claire thought it was Sam, but as it stepped closer, she saw the horror of it. The figure was deformed, Its body stretched in unnatural ways. Its skin was slick with something dark, its eyes huge and bulging, its mouth too wide for its face, full of sharp, twisted teeth. It wasn't Sam anymore. It was something else. Something else. Her breath caught in her throat as it leaned in, its face mere inches from hers. She could feel its cold breath, rank with the smell of death and decay. The creature's grin widened, impossibly wide. "We are Legion," it rasped, the voice no longer Sam's, but a chorus of them, all twisted and distorted into one. "We are what you've always feared, what you've always known." Claire's mind reeled, and in that moment something clicked. The house, the storm, the strange call from Sam earlier that day. It had all been part of this. She wasn't just trapped in a house with a storm outside. She was trapped in something much older, something far darker. This wasn't a storm. It was a barrier, a veil. The shadowy creatures had always been here, hidden in the walls, the earth, the space between the living and the dead. And the storm, the relentless storm outside, had been their key, their call. They were trying to break through, to bring the dead back into the world of the living. They were hungry. Her eyes filled with terror as the creature reached toward her, its fingers long and thin, touching her skin with a cold that burned. And then, just before it could touch her, the ground shifted beneath her, and a sudden force threw her back against the wall, knocking the wind out of her. The shadows recoiled as if repelled by an unseen force. Claire's vision blurred, the room spinning. Her heart raced, her head aching. A voice, a new voice, spoke then, clear and powerful, not the chorus of the dark ones, but something stronger, a presence, a warmth. "You can't take her." The creature hissed, shrieking in fury, but it was too late. The walls around Claire began to pulse with an eerie white light, bright enough to blind her. The darkness shrank back as if burned by the light, the shadows screaming in rage, but powerless against whatever force was now pushing them away. The creature staggered, its body contorting as the light flooded the space. Claire closed her eyes, her heart pounding, until she felt a sudden pull. Warm, soft hands lifting her. The darkness receded, and when Claire opened her eyes again, the room was different. The shadows were gone. The house, once full of oppressive cold and fear, was now silent, still. The storm outside had stopped, the air still and clear. She was lying in front of the fireplace, its flames roaring with life once more. The house was warm, the soft glow of the fire casting familiar shadows against the walls. But when Claire sat up, she knew something had changed. The house was no longer just a house. It was a tomb, a place where the dead and the living could no longer truly escape each other. She looked at the door to the attic, now closed, the silence above as heavy as the grave. The house wasn't done with her yet, but neither was she done with it. As Claire rose shakily to her feet, her eyes fell on the floor where Sam had been, where the shadows had devoured him. Only now, in the thick, eerie silence, she saw something else. A small dark figure, a shadow, crawling in the corner of the room, its shape shifting. It was moving toward her. It was waiting for her. And this time she was ready.